Hi everybody, this is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores our views on death and how they affect the way we live our life. This week we have Joel Bouchard, and he's a doctoral student in psychology, a multi-instrumentalist record producer, author, painter, Army veteran, business leader, local government official, and host of the Philosophy podcast, From Nowhere to Nothing. Let's get to know Joel. Joel, how's it going?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited. Philosophy is definitely my favorite thing in the world to do. I know that's like a weird use of the verb, but philosophizing is definitely in my peak interest group. So after we get over the basic questions, I'd love to just hear your thoughts. And our basic question is really simple. How old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
So I am 35, and I've grown up most of my life in rural Western New York. And so I guess that makes me slap dab in the middle of being a millennial.
Awesome. And I used to live in Ithaca, so I'm curious, which city are you nearest?
Okay. Yeah, I'm like right between Buffalo and Rochester.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I used to run.
So yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but yeah, right around there.
I love that area. I love it so much. I definitely have a tremendous respect for like the land, also, you know, east of the Adirondacks and the Seneca reservations and stuff. It's just beautiful. So,
yeah, it is.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's really interesting. So when did you get into philosophy? Were you like a little child philosophizing and then you heard the term and you got into it, or is it more recent?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because what I like to tell people is that philosophy is everybody's favorite topic. They just don't know it yet, right? Philosophy sort of has the intellectual domain's worst publicist or marketing agent, right? Because, when I never really thought about it much till I went to community college. I thought, okay, well, this is something to do with, guys with big beards and dusty books that are mad at the world. And that's just what it is. And then I took my first philosophy class and I realized, oh man, this is about so much more than stuff that has been talked about in the past by people. This is something that is alive and active, not just in every person on the planet, but in every subject, every topic. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's really when I started to get into it, was in college. And from there, it's just snowballed.
That's awesome. This might be like a really nerdy question to ask, but do you have a favorite philosopher? And it could be as simple as Plato, Socrates, whatever.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a favorite. I think that in most cases, when you're looking at them, each one has things that sort of ring true among a lot of other things that are more or less helpful or just inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's really picking and choosing. It's kind of a smorgasbord of philosophers, but I do like specific ones. I like a lot of what Kant. I like a lot of what Kant had to say, and he was an interesting guy on a personal level. He's really kind of quirky and introverted and kind of a hermit, which I can relate to, but a lot of what he had to say, I find useful and relevant in a modern context as compared to some of the other philosophers who, definitely have things that are still relevant today, but some of it hasn't aged as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that'd probably be my pick if push came to shove, would be Kant. That's
cool. That's a great answer, actually. I have a weird job in addition to my many jobs that I do, but one of them, it's book indexing. So I get paid to get they send me the galley proof of a book right before it's going to press. I have to read the whole book and write the index that goes in the back. Part of it is like really routine and mundane, but part of it's exciting because the books are new and they're fresh, and I get a lot of philosophy textbooks. So Kant is like now like definitely in my wheelhouse because of that experience. And also Kierkegaard blew my mind when I read about, just because like what he did when he did it,
Yeah, that's funny. My nephew is actually named after him. His name's Soren.
That's awesome.
So yeah, in my family we've done a ton of reading about him, and we feel the same way. But yeah, William James too. William James, who's sort of an amalgam between a philosopher and a psychologist, and really one of the few major philosophers to come out of America in terms of classical philosophy. He had a lot of keen insights that, again, I think still ring true today, But
yeah, actually, I'd love to hear you expand on that, because I think I'm always fascinated by this. The philosophical movement of the West was like sparked by the psychology of James and Jung and Freud. So is psychology like a branch of philosophy? Like, how do you view that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when it boils down to it, everything is a branch of philosophy, right? Whether it's
Awesome.
science or art. But I sort of explain it as philosophy is the bookends of knowledge seeking, right? So all of it stems from philosophy. It all starts in philosophy. And then the cutting edge of it all devolves into philosophy, right? It doesn't matter if you're looking at physics or chemistry or biology or whatever it is. All of those things started out as philosophy before they became systematized, before they had ways of establishing epistemologies about what could be concretely known. But when you look at where the cutting edge of the technology and the knowledge and things are today, and how we project into the future and how we make advances in them, that all comes down to philosophy too. You're using knowledge and inductive and deductive sort of reasoning to try to tread a path forward. Even the scientific method, right? The first step is hypothesizing, which is really no more than taking what you know and trying to make a reasoned guess as to what would be true about something that we don't know about yet. So yeah, absolutely. And psychology is an even more interesting aspect than the other areas, because there's sort of this circular thing going on where psychology, our ability to systematically study the human brain, comes from philosophy. But philosophy comes from our psychology, right? We don't see a whole lot of other animals out there wondering about what happens after they die, right? So there's this intimate interconnection between the two fields that I find fascinating.
Yeah, and actually, as I was going to ask this earlier, but one of my favorite modern philosophers is, he's not even called a philosopher, Steven Pinker. I'm sure you're aware of him from Harvard.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just finished Enlightenment Now, which I thought that's a book anybody should read if you're feeling depressed about the current state of the world, which I'm not saying you shouldn't be, but Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker will give you some reasons to cheer up a little bit and think about the future and our current situations a little bit differently. But yeah, definitely a great thinker.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I am like that oddball person, and I love philosophy, but I am an optimist, actually. I'm like for better or for worse, I just always see how this could turn out well, even if it's bad. Part of that is by another philosopher, psychologist, Viktor Frankl, reading his famous book about being in the Holocaust, the In Search of Meaning, or whatever it's called. He talks about how
man's search for meaning.
Yeah, and he talks, and it's so true. Like my greatest tragedy in my life, which I'm not going to get into because I talk about it all the time on this podcast, but it changed me in a fundamentally good way, and it's exactly what Frankl talks about, which is like just in the face of adversity, in the face of all these things. So right now, what I want to ask you, because you're our guest, and I'm really curious about your opinion since you brought it up. Right now, there's it seems to be a big cultural argument, and I would say not even just in America, but across the world, there's a huge momentous growth of populism, for lack of a better term for it. And populism is sort of a philosophy. So I'm just curious, in kind of a two-part question, what is your opinion of populism just as an idea in itself? And then what is your opinion of populism now?
Yeah. I guess there's a lot of different ways that the term's been defined. Why don't you give me a little bit of what you're looking for?
Yeah, the idea, and this is my wording, so for our audience, this is how I feel. We throw around the word democracy a lot. I'll start with there, and democracy is a great idea. Hey, everyone gets a vote, but we all know how it feels when some of the people voting aren't informed, or we don't think they're informed. And I'm not just talking about, again, this question is devoid of politics, even though it crosses into that territory. It's really just about the philosophy of choice and giving choice equally to everyone. And so populism to me is a movement that says the people matter more than anything, and there should be a leader who represents the people and does what the people demand, which is different than we should elect a leader who thinks of everything and then makes decisions on our behalf, but not the way we might make them. Does that gel with you?
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. I think it's a very tricky area. And I think that there's plenty of philosophical thought experiments that can highlight both the positive and possible pitfalls of that sort of thinking. And I think some of it, results in, it's sort of a form of utilitarianism in some ways, which is saying that the greatest good for the greatest number of people, or the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, some people consider the two intertwined. And I think that there's undoubtedly positive aspects to it, right? We all, at least on a surface level, admit that, people should have the same rights and should be, entitled to the same sort of rights and protections that everybody else has. But we don't really act it out all that well. And then we also come to situations like, predictably every 4 years, right? We come to a presidential election and we all complain about how whoever the two candidates are, how did they get here? And why do we always have to pick the lesser of two evils? And we can never have somebody who seems to be up to the task of making everybody happy. And some, there's, if we go back to Plato, right, in the Republic, essentially what he was saying is that, no, you can't just let everybody pick because the majority of people are idiots, right? You kind of have to have you have to have this sort of meritocracy based off of intellect. You want your smartest people to pick who are in charge, and that's the best way to form a society, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know what the answer is, right? I think that ensuring that everybody has equal rights and access to the things that they need to live and to thrive is essential. As far as who has a voice in making that happen, I think that there's too much evidence for both positions for me to comfortably say whether I think a pure democracy or some other form of representative republic would be the better option. I'm not real sure.
Yeah. No, and I love your answer because that's actually a creative and philosophical answer, because I don't think most philosophers are like, hands down, it's this, no question, move on, next question, So I not only agree with you, but I thought that was a good and eloquent take on it. So to kind of, there's a lot of social movements going on in the world, and a lot of them are based on philosophy. And so I'm just kind of curious about how you're in real time reacting to these things. So again, the nature of this podcast is to openly explore things with guests, and there's no gotcha to this, and there's no like repercussions. And I'm sure you've listened to the show and you know that, but I like to say that so my audience also understands that my intention here is to explore good, interesting, and sometimes difficult questions. So my first question for you would be, one of the reasons philosophy is kind of made fun of in America, at least, is that it's a degree that doesn't get you money. Like, you basically, like, I remember when I entered into the major, they're like, hey, you going to be a professor or are you going to beg for change? Because these are your two options. And so I got two other majors. And yet, obviously, philosophy is like the most important thing in the world, because if we're not thinking about thinking and all that, then we're not really doing what humans are best at doing. So how do you feel about the state of the humanities right now? Like, meaning in college, most people don't want to go into the humanities. It's considered a joke. They want to go into STEM, science. And on top of that, there's a huge like political element to colleges now with protests and stuff. And that's not new, but it is being highlighted in the media. So I'm just kind of curious how all of that's bubbling in through your mind. And you can answer that however you want.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely a tricky topic, and with anything, you just applauded me for giving an answer that sort of didn't answer anything, but worked around the problem, and that's what people find frustrating about a lot of philosophy, right? Is that the name of my show is From Nowhere to Nothing, right? So we attempt to answer a lot of questions, but we're rarely successful, right? So what philosophy really is just examining the whole contextual situation and learning what you can, but also understanding that even defining what knowledge is can be quite difficult. So when it comes to philosophy degrees, right, it's really no different. The context provides a lot of complexity to it. And so my master's degree was actually in higher education. So I've got quite a bit of insight into it. And it's a multi-faceted issue. If you look at the attitudes of college goers, what you'll see is in the 50s, 3/4 of college goers said that their primary purpose for going to college was to become a better human being. 60 years later, if you looked at the average college goer, 6 out of 7 of them say that their primary reason for going is to get a career to make money. So the motivations of the college goer have changed. On top of that, when you look at the aid provided to colleges by the government, the numerical value has stayed the same over that period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so at face value, you may say, okay, so nothing's changed. But when you account for the big I in the room that we've all experienced over the past few years, inflation, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, the Pell Grant that used to cover almost your entire degree doesn't even cover your books for the first year, right?
Mm.
So the financial resources that the government is providing to colleges in order to subsidize education for students who need it is no longer there. It's just steadily deteriorated over time until now the price of college is quite high. That's not to say that the educational institutions aren't also complicit in this, because most of their money has gone into brick and mortar expansions, what we call, they're all chasing this Ivy League thing. So they want their institutions to look big and old. So they're all building these brick buildings. They're all putting all this money into landscaping, very expensive projects, sporting projects, right? Arenas that are on the level of professional sports stadiums. And so really the money has not fed back into the programs in the way that it should, if seeking knowledge is your primary purpose for existing. So the whole issue is quite complex, and there's plenty of blame to go around for all parties involved. But the long story short is all three of those things contribute highly to the devaluation and the degradation of the philosophy degree and the humanities in general, right? Because if people no longer seek education to become better people, but only to make money, well, then these degrees don't tend to make you as much money as other degrees.
Yeah.
If the government made college cheap and now they're not, so the burden is much higher. Well, now the stakes are much higher for that piece of paper. That piece of paper turns from being some kind of personal achievement to now being a meal ticket, right?
Yeah.
And the institutions themselves, if they aren't reinvesting in their knowledge pursuits, but are instead taking their earnings and putting them into sporting stadiums or sort of building facades and things, then it's not an honest effort to demonstrate to the public that they do put some value into those programs. So it's a complex topic, but that would be sort of my view on why the philosophy degree is sort of disparaged in the modern day.
Wow, Mr. Bouchard, you are definitely a philosopher, and I love it. I'm having the time of my life in this conversation. I have way too many questions to ask, so we might go long if you can, but I will just do them in order that makes sense.
No, absolutely.
The next question that I think you just immediately reminded me of, and I'll try to keep it quick, is you reminded me of like what a lot of people inside of the Soviet Union complained about Soviet architecture, that like when you start sharing things equally and you just start building ugly gray buildings and everyone lives in the same drab housing, it creates like a bad effect on humanity. So I'm not trying to get you to talk about communism, but I am curious, like, do you believe the aesthetics of the world matter philosophically?
Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's a very easily overlooked area. We've talked about aesthetics quite a bit. I think about aesthetics and axiology, which is the study of value systems and how we assign value to things, to be very important, especially implicitly, right? We don't explicitly think about it, but it has this effect on us. And I mean, it's been demonstrated in the scientific field of psychology, especially in the latter half of the 20th century through behaviorism, that the power of the environment to influence the individual is certainly paramount. And it's interesting to look at high schools. All the high schools that were built in the 70s were built by the same architect who designed the prisons of the same time. And so if you look at high schools built in the 70s and you look at prisons built there, the only difference is the lack of a barbed wire fence, right? And what's the message that sends to students, right? It's not good, right? So you have these sorts of same implicit messages being sent. And so architecture, certainly, I mean, and still to this day, I've been to the cathedral in Strasbourg and a few other just monumental buildings, and to walk in and feel the awe, right? Regardless of what your religious or theological views are, just the buildings themselves, right? There's a reason that people visit the Great Pyramids, that
Yeah.
people visit, the Statue of Liberty, these places, right? If they, they wouldn't visit them if there wasn't some value to the aesthetic of it, something that we were getting out of it.
That's so
And
cool.
so just because that goes for tourist traps, it doesn't at all negate the fact that it sort of encompasses all of our other environmental aesthetic interactions as well.
Cool. That's a great answer, and I completely agree, and especially with the Great Pyramid, just because we know nothing about it, and yet we know that it's more monumental than anything we've ever made since, and it probably always will be. And I just love that because that is such a good example. So what my favorite philosophy movement after college and before I had a family, it helped me a lot, and I see that it's gaining like so much popularity now, is Marcus Aurelius and like Stoicism. So I'm just curious, did you study that at all, and why do you think that's becoming so popular right now?
Yeah, I have studied it, and Meditations by Marcus Aurelius is just a fantastic book. And I think what people are finding out, right, is that they had a skewed view of Stoicism. I think that Stoicism had always been sort of assumed to be the denial of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, it sort of had this toxic masculine stink to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Throughout most of its history to lay people. But I think in the past few years, as people have actually dug into the things that are being said, what they're discovering is sort of a movement that reflects a lot of the views of Eastern philosophies, right? There's a lot of Buddhism types of views in it where you're going, okay, well, I'm not looking to deny emotions, but what I'm looking to do is recognize emotions, accept emotions as part of my life, and then to ultimately live with them and overcome them in a way that they don't cripple me, right? If something bad happens, right, and if I let that ruin my life, well then, what have I accomplished, right? Or if
Mm-hmm.
something really good happens and I get real high on it, well, where's the only place to go from there, right? So this idea of remaining even keeled, if you look at it at face value, it's not something to get excited about. But really, when you think about life fulfillment and how you can kind of go about your life in a way that is meaningful and that is more cognizant of the reality that exists outside of you versus the theater that you've constructed inside and the way that you interpret things. I think people are finding that that's a powerful way of sort of reframing their reference to the world.
Awesome. And that's actually a great segue into the pivotal question of the podcast, which is we ask everyone, as you know, what do you think happens when you die? But I would like to tailor this question to something you touched on earlier, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about, which is whatever your answer is, and I want you to give that first, can you also explain to me how that ties into your concept of free will versus predetermination?
Yes, this is a fantastic. I think I'll start with that first, because
Okay, yeah.
I think that is an important aspect of it. And this is something that we still struggle with today, right? The view of science is that the universe is a monist, empirical, reductionist thing. And that's a big way of saying everything is one thing, and that thing is stuff, physical stuff. And so as a result, if you knew the initial conditions of the universe through physics, and you could basically play the tape forward and you could see all of history unfold until the end of time, and everything that we would do has been determined. I could not do anything other than what I'm doing right now, talking to you on the phone, based off of what happened in the Big Bang, right? So psychology is applied physics, chemistry is applied physics, everything is applied physics. And it doesn't ring true to a lot of people, but what people have to sort of realize is that all of our knowledge, our entire epistemology as a human race is built on this. That's what the science is, right? Is looking at the world this way. So it's undeniably the most powerful tool we have to understanding reality. But that being said, I think that people, especially scientists and philosophers, can have a religious faith in science. They sort of become blind to the fact that science is only able to address certain questions. And there are other questions that it will never be able to address. And I believe that one of those questions is consciousness, right? Because consciousness is a subjective experience of a human being, and there's no objective way of ever being able to qualify that, right? And that was the big thing that Descartes was sort of, the big problem that Descartes shed a light on was that, and the big problem with monism, period, is that if you agree that monism is what's true, then how do you explain mental phenomenon, right? Because I'm thinking right now, but a thought is not a physical thing. A dream is not a physical thing, right? An emotion is not a physical thing. Despite the electrical impulses, the qualitative experience of it is not a physical thing. And so that sort of leans us towards, well, maybe there's a dualistic version, right? Maybe there's a mind and a body, and maybe there is a free will and things can be changed. But as soon as you open that can of worms, your entire ability to know anything becomes quite difficult. You can fall into, sophism, where you're just sort of saying, well, maybe nothing except my own thoughts even exists. We did an episode on my show about Boltzmann brains, right? Which is sort of this weird thought experiment that says it's more likely that a single brain would pop into existence in the middle of an empty void than for a whole universe to pop into existence. So maybe that brain that popped into existence is my brain, and I'm just imagining everything out there. And that's all that there is.
Yeah.
Right? Which is kind of trippy. And it's much more complicated than that. But so the whole point is that since the beginning of philosophy, we've thought about this determinism versus indeterminism, monism versus dualism. And where I come down on it, right, is that, science and viewing the world from an empirical reductionist monist viewpoint is our best way of knowing things. And I think that we have come to what can be described as real knowledge using it. You look at all of our advancements in technology and all of our advancements in different areas. And the fact that advancement has happened, the fact that progress has taken place, indicates that there's things that we have actually learned, and it's a powerful tool. But I don't think that it's going to be able to answer all of the questions. And so therefore, there's always going to be aspects of reality that are inaccessible to scientific understanding, and that will be indeterminate. And I think that indeterminism is sort of mediated by the quantum realm, right? Because what we're finding is that we can't really play the tape forward and predict everything if we knew its initial states. We could in a Newtonian universe, but in a quantum universe where we understand that waves act as particles sometimes, and we don't know if the cat's alive or dead, and all of these different things are random. There's a bit of randomness built into it. Well, if you build randomness into it, you necessarily build uncertainty into it. And the problem with human beings is we hate uncertainty. We always want to think that we know everything or that we can know it.
This was literally a question I had designed to ask you, how important, and now I'm deleting it. So please continue.
So yeah, I think that to be a true philosopher, you have to become comfortable with uncertainty, and you have to enjoy the mystery of knowing that you'll never be able to know. And I think that that's something that only a very strange subset of people can ever be comfortable with. I think everybody else wants to know, they want to believe that they can know, and they sort of build all of their other knowledge off of that belief. And I think that accounts for much religious views, but even atheistic views, right? I don't think that being an atheist is necessarily a better position than being somebody who is religious, right? I think that everybody is necessarily agnostic, right? There's no way that we can know anything about what's outside of the world, metaphysical questions, right? Of which death is one. So that's kind of the determinism, indeterminism part. I don't remember. You probably asked me another question that I haven't answered yet.
Well, You sort of answered it, but I will ask it more directly. So do you think something's going to happen to you when you die and that you'll experience that? Or what is your philosophy on what's going to happen to you when you die?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So as part of my psychological studies, something that's really interested me and I've looked into quite a bit is near-death experiences.
Nice.
And this is something that had really been nobody had wanted to discuss it because it was looked at as being, pseudo-scientific and that sort of thing. And then really Peter Fenwick was kind of the guy to, he was an esteemed scientist, and he said, heck with it, I'm going to study this. And he rigorously looked at near-death experiences and what happens with people. And he was able to identify systematic things that happen when people die, starting about a week before they die, right? Mm-hmm. And some of these things appear quite mystical, right? You start to be visited both in your dreams, but also in your waking life by people who have died before you, right? And there's a long string of things that happen that can be observed, right? Scientifically observed, repeatedly in different cases. And now with the advancements in modern technology, this is really a developing field. I've read some research articles as recent as last week, looking at scientists who are starting to put fMRI and EEG studies on people as they're dying, or as they're being resuscitated or put into sort of a cryogenic sleep before a surgery. All these different areas where you're clinically dead, and seeing what the brain's doing. And what they're finding is that, the brain activity, which we thought ceased with heart activity, really doesn't. And not only does it not stop, it acts in very strange ways where it'll go silent, and then suddenly all of the areas associated with consciousness will fire again. Several, and they're starting to notice patterns of it happening 30 seconds after the heart stops, 6 minutes after the heart stops, in at least one case, an hour after the heart stopped. And so these areas, they're associated with consciousness and wakefulness, right? Areas of the default mode network and places where you recognize this as being somebody who's awake. And there's plenty of evidence of people who demonstrate lucidity in their last moments, right? Somebody who's been in a coma or has had Alzheimer's, and as their last act, they sit straight upright and they say something very lucid, right? And so this is all scientific. We've seen it over and over again. And the question then becomes, what is the meaning behind it? And that's where everything that we've talked about so far comes together, right? If you're an evolutionary psychologist who believes in physical reductionism and monism in the universe, right? You see it as the last gasp of the body to sort of present a defense for itself. It knows it's dying, so what it's going to do is it's going to flood the body with endogenous DMT, and it's going to sort of just try to make this transition into death as smooth and as easy as it can be. But then there's other people that say, it seems too coincidental, right? That somebody who could be in a coma for 20 years or have Alzheimer's for 15 years, that suddenly all of the parts of the brain that make us distinctly human light up, and we have this last moment that corresponds with everything that religions across the world have told us, everything that psychological experiences of people across the world have told us, everything that mystical encounters worldwide, right, have said, this is what will happen, right? And then we have the scientific research of it, right, looking at the process from a week before and laying out all of these things and seeing this trend that sort of persists across humanity. They go, oh, it's too much of a coincidence, And all of that is to say, I don't know.
I understand, yeah.
As in true philosophical fashion, right? I could close my eyes for the last time and that's it for eternity, or there could be an afterlife. There could be Penrose's cyclical universe, right, where everything crunches and expands in the same way. And so I will live my same life over and over again with no recollection of it, eons apart. There's multiverse views where perhaps you'd never really die, but you sort of die in this life and then you transition into a parallel life. And then when you die in that one, you continue to transition throughout. There's a lot of thoughts on it. And as a philosopher, I think that they're all interesting and they're all fascinating. And that's why I get into it. And I think that it's great. But I don't pretend to know. And I don't pretend that it really bothers me, right? It's something that everybody has gone through before and everybody will end up going through. And so I think that it's part of life. It's something that I look forward. Timothy Leary, who was a psychologist who has sort of identified with the counterculture psychedelic movement in the 60s. When he died of cancer in the 80s, he said that he was looking forward to it, right? It's the most exciting experiment that anybody can ever be a part of. This is kind of what he was saying, you know?
Yeah.
And I do agree with that. There's certainly some parts of it that can be scary, but I think that overall it's more interesting than anything.
Well, it's so funny because that was such a great last comment because one, obviously I'm obsessed with this greatest experiment ever. Two, I'm a huge fan of Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, and Timothy Leary and the work they did. With all, stereotypes aside, they did pioneer a movement that totally affects the way I think and reflect on consciousness. And then lastly, you totally tied it into what you said originally, which is like how much setting matters, which is their famous phrase, set and setting. So I think that was like a really, really intelligent and awesome answer. And we've had a lot of NDE experts on the show, and it's definitely my hobby horse since I was like a little kid. So I'm so glad that you actually had so much to add to that conversation. A lot of that was new, and I'm really impressed. We are out of time, but I do always give my guests a short floor at the end of the podcast to just kind of give our audience some sort of message that you'd like to leave them with. So what's something you'd just like the average listener to know?
Yeah, I think that, anybody who's listening to a podcast about death is a philosopher, right? Because I think that if you're not a philosopher, this is the type of topic that you avoid and you push aside and you just live your life like you're never going to die, right? So if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, and if hearing me go on a 10-minute rant covering all of the context of death and then tell you that I don't know the answer doesn't frustrate you to no end, then get involved in philosophy, right? Just get involved with it, and you'll find that it's something that's definitely worthwhile.
That was a great answer. And Joel, thank you again so much. I'm sure you can tell by how much I laughed and just got along with you that I really appreciate this conversation. You're very intelligent. You're very wise. You're also very reasonable. And so I strongly encourage people to listen to his podcast. Again, it will be in the notes, so you'll easily be able to find it. But, if you enjoyed our conversation and if you enjoy the way Joel thinks, I'm sure there's tons and tons of more good content for you to find. So again, his podcast is called From Nowhere to Nothing, and you can easily find it. Just search that on the internet, but there will be a link in the notes. And for everyone listening at home, once again, my name is Mike Oppenheim. You have been listening to Coffin Talk, and the best way to support the show is to head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPT.com, and sign up for the free weekly emails that I send out, which are mostly philosophical, but also humorous and all that good stuff. Thank you again for tuning in. Thank you again to Joel, and we will see you soon.